Jai Ranganathan here, and in this video, we'll be talking about using the Charts module in Drupal 9. Now, the Charts module is a great way to include interactive charts on your Drupal site. The trouble, though, is that there are a lot of things that need to be lined up just so in your Drupal installation for the Charts module to work right. But that's where this video comes in, walking you through all of those steps, well, step by step. First off, let me thank Daniel Cothran, who's the maintainer of the Charts module, and he has been super generous with his time with me. Everything you see in this video is stuff that I learned from Daniel himself, and I figured the community as a whole could benefit from the knowledge. Moving on, this video is split into 6 parts. There are chapter markings in the video itself, as well as time codes for the separate sections in the description below. And I'll start most sections with a summary of the info for that section. The 6 parts are: part 1, what you need to know about Drupal before this video is going to make any sense. Part 2, configuring your Drupal 9 installation for charts. Part 3 through 5, getting your data lined up. And part 6, actually charting your data. Part 1, what you'll need to know for this video to make sense. Well, you don't need to know too much, but you do need to have some basic familiarity with how Drupal works. In particular, you'll need to understand how to install and enable modules. You'll also need to understand views in Drupal. And lastly, you'll need to have access to the back end of the server where your Drupal installation is located. And that access can either be via the command line or FTP. If you don't know what some of these things are, no problem. I have some resources listed in the description below. Read up on that and come right back to this video. Part 2, configuring your Drupal installation for the Charts module. Now, what you'll need are 4 modules installed and enabled, plus some JavaScript as well. And you can see those provided in the screen here with links to these provided in the description below. Now, let's get to it. Now, here we can see my Drupal installation. This is Drupal 9.3. I just installed it, brand new, not much to it. And let's look at the modules that I've already installed. Now, what you're going to need for, you're going to need 4 modules, as I mentioned before. One of them is media. Now, this is already part of core, so you don't need to install it. You just need to enable it. Beyond that, we've got charts, which is, of course, the module that we care most about. And you'll notice here, there's a couple of possibilities here. And the reason is, let me describe a bit how the charts module works. It works by piggybacking upon already existing JavaScript libraries for charting, such as C3, HighCharts, or Google Charts. In this case, in our example, we're going to be using Google Charts. So which is why you can see here, I have enabled the Charts module as well as Google Charts. Now, what's the difference? Charts is the Drupal module. Google Charts is the JavaScript library. And clicking on that allows the Drupal module to integrate with the JavaScript Google Charts library. Beyond this, you're going to need the feeds module, and you'll also need the storage entities module, which you can see clicked here as well. And as I mentioned before, links to all of these are provided in the description below. But once you have installed and enabled these modules, you're not quite done yet. And the reason is that because you install and enable the right modules, we still need the JavaScript in the Drupal installation that's actually going to do the charting. In our case, we're using Google Charts. And here we're going to switch over to actually putting that in. And in my case, we're going to do it via FTP, but lots of ways. We can actually install that JavaScript via Composer, if you're familiar with that, or command line, if you're familiar with that. That I thought maybe the simplest way is just via a GUI FTP interface. In my case, I'm using FileZilla. Now here we can see in the left-hand side my downloads folder on my personal computer, and on the right-hand side I'm already logged in to my Drupal installation. Now what do we actually need to put in to our site? And in our case, because we're using Google Charts, you can see here on the left side, and this is my own computer on the left side, I've created a folder called Google_Charts, and that has a JavaScript library in it called loader.js. So we need to transfer this over to the Drupal installation for Google Charts to work. And so how do we do that exactly? So here we are. If we look over to the right side, and again, this is us logged in to my Drupal installation, and I'm at the top level here of the directory. So the very top level for Drupal, and you can tell if you log into yours, you'll be able to tell because you'll be able to see these 5 folders at least: core, modules, profiles, sites, themes. If you see those in your installation, you're in the right place. And if it's not already there, you want to add a folder called libraries. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, and now into this libraries folders, we want to add this Google Charts folder, which contains loader.js. And there it is. And it's very important that you label this directory Google_Charts, or none of this is going to work. And as before, the link to where you might find loader.js is in the description below. Part 3, defining the data that you want to chart in Drupal. Now, we need to add a storage type for every kind of data set that we want to chart. So what does that mean? Let's get into it. So here we are again. We are my test Drupal 9.3 site. And let's first take a look, though, before we get to this. Let's look at the data that I want to chart. And here is a made-up data set, squirrel index, which shows the threat of squirrels in my backyard, going back from 1985 to 2005, completely made up. And we can see here that our data is comprised of 2 columns. Well, we've got year, which is an integer, and then we've got a measure of squirrel threat, which certainly bounces up and down a whole lot, which is a decimal. And these are the 2 key factors we need to know. 2 columns, one's an integer, one's a decimal. So now let's go to structure. And under structure, we'll now have an option called storage types. And we want to add a storage type for this kind of data. So let's add storage type. I'm going to call this 2-column time series data. And I'm going to add some fields. In fact, I'm going to add 2 fields. The first is I'm going to add a number integer, which I'm going to call year. And very important, I'm going to include only 1 value. And everything else, make this a required field. And then everything else is fine. I'm going to add a second field for my squirrel threat. And let's call this number decimal. And I'm going to call this value. Let's see. So for this, I'm going to leave the precision as 10 and the number of digits to the right of the decimal. Well, we can see here there's never more than 2 digits to the right of the decimal. So all these defaults look fine. Allowed number of values limited is 1. That's fine. I'm going to make this a required field. And that's it. And we are done with defining our data structure. Part 4. Defining our data import process. Once our storage type is defined, the next stop is to tell Drupal, well, where's the data coming from? And also, what's the relationship between the data coming in and our storage type? This is what's called a feed. And so our next stop is to define our feed. What does that mean? Let's get into it. So here we are again at the Drupal 9.3 installation. We're going to go to Structure, down to Feed Types. Now, what I'm going to be doing here is, here we have the squirrel index. I'm going to download this as a CSV, meaning comma delimited. And you can see I've just downloaded it to my hard drive there. So I'm going to add a feed type for this, which defines what the import process looks like. I'm going to call this first feed. I'm going to now under fetcher, I'm going to say upload file. The parser is going to be CSV because that's how I save the data, as comma delimited. I'm going to save this as storage. And the cont storage type is 2-column time series data, which we already defined in the previous section. Now let's look through all our settings, make sure they're all right. Settings, well, I should mention that the feed module is incredibly powerful and allows you to pull live data in a regular basis. But for this, since our CSV data, we're only pulling this once, we don't need to be pulling in live data on a regular basis. So our import period is once and never again. Fetcher settings, that's good. Parser settings, we're going to leave that as comma. And we're going to leave this as the no headers unchecked because our data does have a header row. And lastly, we're going to leave all of this the same under processor settings, except I'm going to hit owner feed author. I'm going to hit that click. So that makes the owner of this data, well, me. So I'm going to save and add mapping. So what have I done thus far? Thus far with this feed settings, I've just told this where the data is coming from. It is coming from a CSV on my hard drive. That's what Drupal knows. But now we need to sort of map onto our existing storage type the connection between the fields of the incoming data and our storage type. So what we'll need to do is we need to select a target for each of the storage types. So here we have value, field value, and if we look here, we can see here, we've got 2 columns, year and squirrel threat. Value corresponds to squirrel threat. So I'm going to select a source here from where the data is coming from. I'm going to hit new CSV source. And I need to put in the exact name of that column, which you can see here is called squirrel underscore threat with squirrel and threat capitalized. Okay, and then there's the second column I need to add in, which is the year. I'm going to do exactly the same thing again. Select a source, again, new CSV source. And here you can see the title, the header is called year, capital Y year. So that's what I'm going to put here, year. And lastly, we need to add our name. So under name, I'm going to include this as the feed title. And there we have it. So I'm going to hit save. And we've now part 5, importing our data into Drupal. Now that we've defined our data structure and we've defined our feed type, now we actually need to add a feed to get our data into Drupal. What does that mean? Let's get into it. Okay, here we have our Drupal 9.3 installation, and we are going to go to content. Now, 2 things I'd like to point out here in content. You'll notice there's a bunch of tabs up top, and 2 of them in particular I'd like to point out to you. Feeds, which is currently blank. That's going to change. And storage data, which is currently blank. But this is where our data is going to end up. So let's go back to feeds, and let's add a feed. And let's call this first, let's call this squirrel threat. Asks me to choose a file. It's coming from my hard drive. So there we have it. A CSV file. And that's pulling it in. And yes, I want to leave the delimiter as a comma because it's a comma delimited file. Definitely don't check no headers. I don't want to make this active because I don't want to make this an active import. Authoring information looks good, so we're going to hit save and import. Great, and there we have it. So let's go back now and look back at content. And here we can see under feeds, we now have one feed that's been added, squirrel threat. But now if we look at storage data, we can see we have a whole bunch of things here. If we click on any one of these, we'll see it contains a year and a value. So basically, each one of these nodes here under squirrel threat is a row of the data. So let's assume if this was 100 rows long of data, we would have 100 rows here. So that's how you get data into Drupal to plot. Part 6, charting our data. Well, we finally did it. With a lot of pain, we actually got our data into Drupal. Now all that's left to do is to actually plot it. How do we do that? Well, the way to do that is to create a view, and in that view, set the format as chart. Let's get into how to do that. So here we are again at the front page of our Drupal 9.3 site. I'm going to go to Structure, Views. I'm going to add a view. I'm going to call this Squirrel Threat. And under View Settings, I'm going to change the Show Content to Show Storage of type 2-column time series data, because remember, that's the only kind of data we've actually defined so far. Well, let's create a page, Squirrel Threat. That's all. Seems great. Okay, and so now let's add some fields which contain our data, because currently all we have now is the name, which is not going to be very helpful. So under fields, we're going to add. Under category above, we're going to change this to storage. If we scroll down, we should see our two fields which have data in them, value and year. And you can tell that because that appears in 2-column time series data. So that's our clue. So value and year, I'm going to select both. I'm going to create a label for configure field storage value. I'm going to change that to Squirrel Threat. For configuring field storage year, everything, all the defaults will be just fine. And if we scroll down here under preview, we can see here now that we've got our data, but it is not yet charted. Well, we're about to change that. Under format, let's change unformatted list to chart. Our chart type is a line, so that's fine. Charting library is Google, because that's the only one where we have JavaScript for, so that's the only possibility right now. Grouping field, we're going to leave as none. The chart under charts field, under the label field, this is the x-axis, so that's going to be storage year. That's what we want as our x-axis. And then field name provides data. This is what we want as our y-axis. That's going to be Squirrel Threat. Under here, under display, let's give our chart a name. Let's call this threat index. Putting the title outside, that's fine. Data labels, sure, let's enable that. Legend, I think we can do without that. Dimensions, I don't really like the auto, so I'm going to change this dimensions to say, I don't know, 800 pixels wide to 600 pixels tall. Horizontal axis, this is the x-axis. I'm going to change this to make this year. The vertical axis, the y-axis, I'm going to change this to squirrel threat. Let's apply all of that. If we scroll down, okay, we can see we have our chart, but we're not quite done yet. We have a couple of things to do, because you'll notice is if we look at our actual data here, we've got about 20 years of data from 1985 to 2005. But here we just go from 1985 to about 1994. Well, what happened? Well, we need to change this use pager mini. Change that to display all items. Let's keep that as 0. And you can see now we have all 20 years of data. Oh, something else I forgot to mention. Under filter criterion, let's make sure we've include the name of our feed, because we might imagine we might have lots of 2-column time series data. And we just want to chart the squirrel and not the other ones. So just to refresh our memory of what that looks like, under storage data, that all of this has the name squirrel threat. So we're going to add this as a filter in the view. So under filter criteria, we're going to add under name, we're going to say is equal to squirrel threat. And that's not going to make any difference in our case, only because we haven't put in any other data. But if you had more data in, it might well make a difference. So one last thing we need to do is we need to change permissions. So under access permissions, under page settings, we're going to change that to unrestricted, so that everyone can see it. Hit save. And we can look at our page now. And here we have it. Here we have a page with our data plotted. We can see if we hover over a point, we get our year and the data plotted, data points given to us. And we can also, because this is a view, let's go back to view for a second. We can also set this up as a block if we so wanted. So there you have it. Any thoughts or questions? Please leave a comment or get in touch with me directly. Hope this helps.